All right, and we can begin. So welcome everyone. This is our Stittsville budget Q&A for 2023. I'm Councillor Glen Gower, and I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I see a lot of residents in attendance. We're also joined by Cyril Rogers, the City of Ottawa's Acting Chief Financial Officer. Welcome, Cyril. Cyril is a Stittsville resident as well, coincidentally. So it's great to have you, Cyril, as part of this discussion. I'll just give a bit of a brief overview of how tonight's going to work. We've got a 1 hour Q&A plan for tonight. We're going to begin with a short presentation on the 2023 budget and the budget process from Cyril. I'm going to share a little bit of information about some specific Stittsville projects where we have investment proposed for this year. And then we're going to go to a Q&A, and we want to try to answer as many questions as possible. The best way, if you have a question, is to use the Q&A panel. If you're on your desktop, you should see the Q&A button along the bottom of the screen. And if you're on a phone, you're going to have to play around a little bit on the Zoom screen, but you should see a Q&A button, and you can type in any questions or comments you may have there, and we'll try to get as many of those answered as we can today. Now, we can also go to people and have you ask a question live, but we're going to have to kind of see how much time we have and see how many questions we get. We just want to try to get as many of the written questions in as possible. So questions or comments via the Q&A panel. And we have a few questions that were submitted in advance as well. So we'll get to those as well as we go through here. So without further ado, I will turn things over to Cyril for an overview of our draft 2023 budget for the City of Ottawa. Cyril.
Thank you, Councillor, and thank you for the fellow Stittsville residents for coming out tonight and looking at this brief presentation. So as the Councillor said, my name is Cyril Rogers. I'm the Acting Chief Finance Officer and General Manager of Corporate Services at the City of Ottawa. So I'm going to take you through a small presentation in terms of the overall budget and kind of keep it at a level that hopefully that's a little bit more digestible as opposed to the 1,200 plus page document that we do have available online. So basically, every year we go through an extensive process in developing the budget. It's not a process that starts in December and finishes in February, March. It's a process that really effectively is ongoing 12 months of the year. So effectively, once this budget is adopted on March 1st, we'll be jumping right into the planning process for 2024 budget. So it really is a living live document that we work on, 365 days of the year. When we started developing our operating budget, obviously one of the core things at the municipal level, which is a little different from provincial and federal governments, the municipalities are required to submit a balanced budget. And what that really means is if you look at the bottom of the page there, expenditures less revenues equals your taxation. So all the costs that we incur needs to equal to the revenues coming in. So we actually do have a balanced budget. One of the main drivers that we have in a municipality is we are heavily dependent on resources, so full-time equivalents or staffing costs. We are in a unionized environment. The overall budget is about 48 to 50% driven by compensation and benefit costs. So we start the budget bill each year based on the collective agreements that have settled. Most of our collective agreements have settled for 2023, which is a good thing. Then when we layer on the other things, we look at, the growth in the city. The city is growing quite a bit, throughout Stittsville, lots of new subdivisions, lots of new lane kilometers of roads that is brought online. So we look at the cost to maintain these from a winter operations perspective. And then we look at all the capital assets in terms of the various long-range financial plans that we have in place to kind of meet the obligations and commitments that council has directed us to do so. Then when we look at some of the other components, we're always looking at efficiencies. We are an organization that really much focuses on continuous improvement. Since amalgamation dating back to the early 2000s, the city has flowed through well over $400 million worth of savings and efficiencies over the years. So it's kind of core to our service. The 2023 draft budget does include approximately $54 million worth of savings and efficiencies. And that really allows us to kind of reinvest into key priority areas as we kind of streamline the way we do things. Another big component in 2023 is assessment growth. So taxes from new assessment. Basically what that is any new property that will pay a tax bill in 2023 that didn't pay a tax bill previous to 2023. So if a new home was built in 2022 and now it's being occupied, that's a brand new incremental 1 unit that's being paying property taxes in 2023. So that's incremental new revenue coming in from growth. In 2023, the assessment growth is at 2.2%, which is one of the highest assessment growths that the city has experienced to date. This slide, basically, what we tried to pick here is the 2023 draft budget is a $4.5 billion budget. And really, we're allocating that budget to all these service areas that you see around the screen. And approximately 60% of that is allocated to 4 main key areas: our water and sewer, Ottawa Police Services, transit and community social services. Those are the 4 largest service areas within the city. A couple notes to point out here is the community and social services, which you'll see on the next slide, is largely funded through provincial funding. So a lot of that funding is basically handed down to the City of Ottawa, and then we deliver those services. So we have limited discretion in terms of if we have the ability to reallocate that funding elsewhere. We're really restrained by that funding source and that funding flow through. Obviously, transit is a significant budget given the capital infrastructure and the network that we service across the city. And then Ottawa Police Services, as another example, is basically governed by the Police Services Act, which we have limited control or discretion over in appointing those costs. The couple other components I'll point out: the capital formation costs. What is that? Basically, what that is that's $403 million that we allocate from our operating into our capital program. So that flows into our various capital reserves, which is almost like our cash contribution towards all the capital projects across the city that we're investing in. And lastly, before I move on, is I would like to highlight the general government. So that 5.4%, that covers all the administrative type cost structure in the city. So it'll be your finance, IT, HR, city clerk, mayor's office, etc. And that is extremely low. That's a pretty lean administrative type function. Most organizations tend to be in that 15 to 20% when you look at the overall administrative support of other comparable organizations. This slide, so basically, how do we pay for all this? So the $4.5 billion budget is funded through these various areas. Around 50% is through taxation. So payment in lieu of taxes and property taxes, that's what we gather from the property tax bill. The payment in lieu of taxes is basically federal government, crown corporations. They don't receive an actual tax bill like a residential property does. They have different legislation where what we call is payment in lieu of taxes. So effectively, it is a tax. It's just a little different than the actual property tax bill that residents would receive. The federal, municipal, provincial grants, this is largely the community and social services funding. So your long-term care, your child care, et cetera. Most of those social services are funded approximately 80% plus from the provincial funding. So that funding flows through the city, and then we deliver that service. The fees and services charges, this is basically your water bill, your transit ridership, your parks and recreational programming, swim lessons, et cetera. So those fees are services where the user pays for the service rather than the property tax bill. The 2023 capital program, it's just over $1 billion for the draft 2023 budget. That's largely allocated. The main driver behind the capital program is what you see, the drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater, and what we label as the integrated roads and water and wastewater services. Effectively, those two programs are very much similar. Those are supporting the rate infrastructure that's supporting your water infrastructure, your wastewater infrastructure. The integrated roads and water and wastewater services, what that is if we need to replace a pipe on Main Street, we got to dig up the road to get to the pipe. So that's why it's called integrated. We do the road at the same time as we do the piping under. And basically, the nature of the rate program is a very capital intensive program. So that's why most of their funding goes to the capital programming. Transit services, obviously, these are largely for our new buses, bus refurbishments, et cetera. Transportation services, these are where you would see your buildings or your your roads resurfacing. So if we could do a roads resurfacing in Stittsville, this is where that budget would flow through there. How's that capital program funded? So 63% is funded through reserves. Basically, this is what we would call cash. So this is our kind of our cash account. So this is actual cash dollars that we use to fund the capital program. Debt on the other side of the screen at 21.8%. So 230 million is funded through debt. This is very similar to a mortgage. You take a mortgage on your house, you help fund the purchase of your mortgage. We use the same kind of simple process as we do for our funding program for capital, and then development charges. So these are basically new subdivisions that are built throughout Stittsville. They pay development charges, and that funding helps pay for the infrastructure in terms of the pipes and the roads and et cetera to kind of get into that new subdivision. Expenditure discretion. So basically what we're highlighting here is most of the city's budget is, we do have limited discretion. And what I mean by that is, if I break it down by different services, so if I look at the police services budget, City Council as a whole does not have authority in terms of directing how the police services allocates their budget. They are governed by the Police Services Act through the Ontario legislation, and they have their own board, which is the Police Services Board, that kind of provides that mandate for police services. When we look at the non-discretionary component to 33.5%, again, largely the community and social services programs. So that funding flows through from the province, mandated by the province to the city, and then we deliver that service from a long-term care, public health, housing, etc. Other programs such as on the other side of the screen where we look at transit and fire and paramedics. If we do cut any of those budgets or any of those funding to those programs, there would correlate to a service reduction. So if we were to take money away from fire, that means that fire has less funding, so they would ultimately have to reduce their service delivery. Same as the library recreational direct service programs. That funding is directly related to programming, recreational fees, skating lessons, swimming lessons, etc. So ultimately, we're left with the support services at 5.4%, but effectively, that's basically the limited discretion that we would have within the budget. And again, we need that funding to support the various administrative type services that the city provides. 2023 budget directions. So the directions report went to council on December 7th and then adopted December 14th. So the budget directions provides my team, my staff with the final piece of the puzzle, if you will, in terms of building the annual budget process. That direction was provided at property taxation increase at 2.5%. As previously mentioned, we do have 3 different city services in terms of tax levies. There's a specific tax levy for police services, one for transit services, and then one for citywide tax supported services. So they're all increasing at 2.5%. I spoke to it earlier, the overall assessment growth from new tax roll, new housing coming online is at 2.2%. The rate program overall will be increasing at a total of 4.2%, which aligns to the long-range financial plan that was approved back in 2018 timeframe. And then we're also guided by various other fiscal frameworks, long-range financial plans, capital plans such as DC background study, etc. So then we take that away and we build the budget based on all those parameters that we have as per outline here. The budget process. So again, this is the formal process. In an election year, things do shift. Obviously, the new council members were sworn in late November. So basically, the budget directions report went there shortly thereafter. It is a very condensed, tight budget cycle, the first year of an election year, mainly because we do need to have a budget adopted by the beginning of March. So the councillor-led consultation started in January. The committee meetings have already started. We are now, after today, I think we're 3 or 4 committee meetings in. There's committee meetings rest of this week and into the next week and a half. Then finally, on March 1st, the final budget will rise back to council and be deliberated and hopefully adopted on March 1st. As mentioned, so basically this is the schedule of the various committee and commission meetings that were occurring as starting throughout mainly throughout February. it is a very tight timeline, it's a very tight schedule. Residents do have the ability to come out to any of these meetings and have a public delegation. Today we had Emergency and Protective Services Committee today, and then later this week we have Planning and Housing Committee, and then following with up to the budget adoption on March 1st. Additional resources and tools. So again, your council-led consultations like tonight is an avenue for input to the budget. We do have Engage Ottawa, which is an online engagement platform. There's also ottawa.ca budget, which is through our website, various social media channels. And also, like I mentioned, the budget is a 365-day process at the City of Ottawa. So, input is always welcome through your councillor's office, and through other platforms, not just during the deep dive of the budget process, but, it is an iterative process where we're always welcoming feedback. And that ends my presentation, Councillor.
Great, thanks for that, Cyril. And I'll just add on a couple slides before we go to the Q&A, and it's about some of the specific Stittsville investments. So let me see if I can bring this up. I don't think it's going to let me. So you know what? Rather than messing around with technology, why don't I just give you a quick overview of some Stittsville investments. So on the Stittsville side of things, we have infrastructure. So there is some specific money in this year's budget for road renewal, repaving of roads. We don't have a final list yet, but some of the roads include Cherry Drive, McCooey Lane, and Shea Road. And there's also some drainage culvert work on Woodwind Crescent over in the Fringewood neighborhood. Transportation, there's a pretty significant one. It's the money for the design of the Carp Road widening between the Queensway and Hazeldean Road. So that's one of the final steps needed before the actual upgrade of Carp Road takes place. There's a number of investments in parks and recreation to rehabilitate or replace parks or recreation facilities. The roof here at Cardo Rec needs replaced. That's a significant expense. Replacing play structures at Crossing Bridge Park, resurfacing walkways at Forest Creek Park, installation of a universal washroom at the library. Two big investments. One is at the Fernbank District Park. This is the new major park in the Abbotsville Crossing neighborhood, just east of Robert Grant Avenue. Shea Woods Park, there's money to finalize fencing and other basic landscaping so that we can formally open Shea Woods Park as a dog run, and also money towards the new Canada West District Park, which is a large park near the Connections neighborhood north of Fairwinds, kind of behind the police station. And then there's also investments to build new parks in new neighborhoods. And then on transit, there are a number of new accessible bus stop upgrades along Stittsville Main Street, Rouncy Road, and so on. And those are the highlights for the Stittsville budget. I have details about each of these, including the investment details, on my website. So if you go to glengower.ca, you'll have to scroll down a little bit on the homepage where you can search for budget 2023, and you'll find all of that information there. There's information about the city budget and links to some of those links that Cyril had shared too around the ottawa.ca budget pages and so on. So thank you, Cyril, for that overview. I was thinking the two things that strike me the most every year about the municipal budget in the province of Ontario. One is that we have to have a balanced budget. We can't borrow, we can't run a deficit. It really has to net out at zero. So that really forces a lot of discipline when we're doing our budgets, because if we spend too much, we would have to raise property taxes. So it's not as easy as perhaps the province or the federal government may have it, where they have more leeway to run deficits and so on. And the other one is you had a slide about discretion, and it's restrictions that we have and how we can use money. For example, the money that you pay on your water bill, we can't take that and use it to build a new park. It has to be spent specifically on water infrastructure. Or even things like the photo radar, the fines from that, again, they can't be used to improve our transit program. They have to be used specifically on enforcement or road safety initiatives. So there's a lot of constraints that we work under when we're crafting the budget. Okay, we have some questions coming in already, which is great, and I'll share the questions, and some of them, Cyril, you'll be able to answer. Some of them may have some answers. I want to go to a couple that we had come in before we started tonight. One was from Dean, and it was a very Stittsville specific question about fire protection, in that some homeowners, some property owners in Stittsville pay a rural rate for fire protection on their tax bill, and some people pay an urban rate on their tax bill. Now, all neighborhoods in Stittsville are equally covered by the fire service, and but there's a different rate for both sides. And the question was, when is this being harmonized? At some point, it would make sense to have everyone living within the suburban area, that's the urban area, pay the same rate. Now, as far as I know, there is a report coming to the Emergency and Protective Service Committee, and possibly the Finance and Corporate Services Committee this year. But do you know anything more about the timing for that, Cyril? Is that file familiar to you?
I don't have the exact timing, but I believe it will be coming to Emergency Protective Services. I'm trying to think. I was at Emergency Protective Services today, but I can't recall exactly the timing. I would suspect probably in the second half of this year is when I would expect to see it. Okay,
and it's based on kind of we'll call it an arbitrary line. I'm sure there was a good reason back at amalgamation, but there was a line drawn, and as Stittsville's continued to expand to the south and the west, for whatever reason, that line hasn't been updated, but there is a plan eventually to harmonize that. We'll see a report and more details later this year. So thank you, Dean. We had another question that came in from Neil, and it was about fire hydrants. It was, I guess, a comment or a question. He wants to see more investment this year to help clear fire hydrants more quickly when we have lots of snow like this. So I was thinking about that, Cyril, and I'm not 100% sure through a budget how we would address that. And I wonder if that's something that we address more programmatically through policy rather than through a budget itself. Like if we were to just add $1 million for fire hydrants, would that actually allow us to hire staff, or how would we approach a question like that from a budgeting perspective?
That one would be more of I see it more as a policy or business process. The challenge we have with those scenarios is we do deal with the extreme variability of snowfall. This winter has been not the norm, because we've had way more snow this year so far than we did all of 2022. So I think this is more of a business process type, collaboration with the fire service in terms of what they employ in terms of, clearing those fire hydrants and the speed at which they do clear them. What I would say is one of the dynamics of this winter season is the amount of snowfall that we've had back to back, and the speed of the snowfall during each event has posed a different challenge than we normally would have seen in previous winters as a comparator.
Now, a follow-up on that, we have a budget line that includes snow clearing operations. What happens if we get an exceptional amount of snow like we do in a year like this? How do we account for that? Is there emergency money set aside, or how does that work?
Yeah, so basically we have what we call a tax stabilization reserve. That reserve is held. We did go forward with a reserve policy in 2017, 2018 timeframe. There's a recommended minimum balance to hold in that account, and we're slightly above that right now. And what we use that account for is those one-off unforeseen type areas such as winter operations. Fingers crossed that at the end of the year, so our winter operations basically is now January through April. Then in the second half of the year, we calendarize our budget for November, December. So there's been years where we've seen a little bit of erosion of the budget in the first half, but then we kind of see a slower use of that budget in the second half of the winter season. But we do report back quarterly through committee and council in terms of status updates. But ultimately, if there is a deficit, the tax stabilization is the backstop for the overall city services.
Okay. All right. Well, some of the questions coming in through the Q&A panel. Please use the Q&A panel if you have a question. This is from Peter. What is the amount of money the city has allotted to Stittsville? That's a really interesting question, because there's a few ways to answer that. But Cyril, if you were asked that question, because it comes up often at these budget meetings, how would you answer that? What's the amount of money allotted to Stittsville?
So the challenge is I'll try and be simple here. So we do try and do a ward by ward summary for every councillor. Councillor Gower did mention some of the streets that's being done there. So those direct investments from a capital perspective are more easy to identify because we can go out and say, you know, Stittsville Main Street is going to be resurfaced or street ABC within Stittsville. The challenge is when you try and break down the overall budget, it is a very detailed budget at the department and service area. So we don't break that down. So I'll stay on the topic of winter operations. We don't look at our winter operations and say, okay, this is how much is spent on Stittsville versus Canada versus the rural area, et cetera. That will be extremely onerous and administrative. So we do keep it at the service area level. So we do keep it at the winter operations level. That's why it's a challenge to say, you know, specifically of that 4.5 billion, it would be extremely hard and difficult to allocate every city service. How much of my time should be allocated to Stittsville versus Canada as a very extreme example? Probably, I wouldn't say impossible, but the variability and the value of doing so would be extremely costly and onerous to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, and then you have things like I saw today at Emergency and Protective Services. I think there was a approval to hire 14 new paramedics. That benefits Stittsville, but it's hard to really quantify. Some of the projects I mentioned, I'll just give you a flavor. There's $595,000 proposed for the road renewals in Stittsville. On the rehabilitation of parks, there's $1.3 million allocated. The Shea Woods Park, the work there, that's a separate $584,000. So that information is on my website, and that has the breakdown of all the different costs. So Peter, you'll get an idea of that there. Peter had a second question. Cyril, might be a little easier to answer. What is the budget for IT in the city?
That's a good question. You're testing me because I recently was appointed the general manager of corporate services. The IT budget for 2023 is roughly $80 million. Yeah. Okay.
And if someone wanted to dive into that and see specifics, that is all on the ottawa.ca/budget website, all the documents and books. Yeah. Okay.
And that will be part of the, so information technology, IT, that will be part of the finance and corporate services committee budget book details.
Okay. I'm not going to put you on the spot on this because I think take a little bit to look this up, but Peter also had a question specifically about cloud computing and what the city spends on cloud computing services. So Peter, I'll offer you this. If you can email me with that question, I will share that with our IT head, and we'll make sure we get you that information about specifically what's spent on cloud to the extent that we can break it down. But we should be able to get you at least some general information there. We have a question from Debbie. This is about the police budget. Is there any leeway at all for the 29 police officers? Is there no way that some of that money could be diverted to some of the alternative policing options identified by the community? Another big question. Now, Cyril, you were the financial head of the Ottawa Police recently. I have some thoughts on this. I don't know if you wanted to weigh in on the police approach in general. It's a little bit of a separate budget from the city budget, but obviously related since it's something taxpayers are contributing towards.
Yeah, so I guess the first response would be, again, the police services budget is mandated by the Police Services Act, which is provincially legislative. They have their governing board, which is the Ottawa Police Services Board. Council cannot direct or influence where their funding envelope is allocated to. What residents can do is residents can attend the Ottawa Police Services Board's budget deliberations. I think their Finance and Audit Committee meets on Wednesday of this week, I believe. Mm-hmm. So that will be an avenue for input. And obviously, you know, through your councillor, there's an avenue for your councillor to kind of report back through his colleagues on the Police Services Board as well in terms of suggestions or how they allocate those resources for what they put forward in their draft budget.
I know last year in the 2022 budget, we did allocate some money to, well, there are a couple areas. There was something like $2 million going towards programs, community programs, mental health programs, addiction programs, specifically to address root causes of crime. And also there was you may know this better than I do, Cyril, I think about $500,000 for a call referral program. With the idea behind that is not every call needs to go to 911 for a police response. That could be redirected to a different kind of response, especially some of the mental health related calls that police might be responding to. And I know the current police chief has indicated it's an area he wants to continue working with other partners in the city to explore alternative response and looking at what other cities across North America are also starting to adopt as well. So personally, I think we do need the police officers. I think if you look at other municipalities in Ottawa in terms of per capita coverage, one of the things I hear so often from residents in Stittsville is concerned about auto thefts, is concerned about speeding, is concerned about police response times. And I think if you compare us to other cities, we probably don't have the right number of personnel to do that. So alongside new police officers, we do also need investment in community programs and prevention programs and better supports for to start to address some of the root causes. But definitely it'll be something that comes up at the police board and their meetings and at the March 1st meeting as well, I'm sure. Thanks, Debbie, for the question. A question from Peter asking about sidewalks on John Woods. I can take this one. So we have sidewalks on John Woods. So this is something that I've requested a couple years in a row now in terms of a capital expenditure to what's now on John Woods is just an old path. It doesn't meet current accessibility standards. It's quite narrow and not in good shape. We have that on a short list for active transportation projects. So it didn't make the cut for this year's capital programs, but I'm hoping we'll see that in a future budget for a capital investment in Stittsville. So it's on a short list, but did not make the cut for this year, unfortunately. From Debbie, did the city ever get any financial assistance from the province for the derecho costs? Some farmers have significant costs and need to support. I don't think so, but Cyril, do you have any updates on provincial financial assistance?
No, that's correct. To date, we have not received any funding from the province on the derecho related costs.
Okay. I know at the end of last term, council passed a motion asking the mayor to put some pressure on Premier Ford and the provincial government. Yeah, as far as I know, that hasn't resulted in anything, but there's a lot of rural property owners who were hit particularly hard. There's also a lot even in our Ottawa community, in the urban community and suburbs, who had costs that weren't necessarily covered by insurance. And it's something that I'm really concerned about, that it's never been covered in any way and was one of the big financial pressures on us last year during the budget.
Yep. And I just want to add, Councillor, there's been extensive advocacy to the province for funding, but unfortunately at this point in time, we haven't received any funding from the province.
Mm-hmm. And the funding is contingent on a percentage of our overall city budget. Like it's a percentage. If the total damages are above a certain percentage of your city budget, they will pay out. And so we had this strange situation where some very small rural communities in Ontario only had like $1 or $2 million of expenses, and the province covered them because it represents a very high proportion of their overall taxes in that municipality. But here in Ottawa, even though our expenses were in the tens of millions of dollars, we didn't meet the province's minimum percentage threshold. So it's really frustrating that, I mean, whether you live in I don't know, rural southwestern Ontario or rural Goulburn, you're as a property owner, you're still affected, but the provincial formula just prevents them from providing funding. It's not good. A question for Mark. How much debt does the city currently hold? How much is the debt servicing costs? And is it growing due to rate increases?
I don't have the exact numbers, but what I can speak to is in the transmittal report, which is a pretty good document report that we table along with the other budget documents. And there's a couple of different components in city debt. So the provincial legislation's got a requirement where municipalities in Ontario, their debt servicing tax coverage needs to be below 25%. And what that means is any tax supported debt needs to be 25% or less of the property tax revenue that you bring in. This city, or in this council or previous councils for the City of Ottawa, they took that 25% limit and they brought that down to 7.5%. Mm-hmm. Where we are today in the draft 2023 budget is we are just shy of 4%, which I think is around 3.8 or 4.2%. So we're well below that provincial threshold, well below the city council directed threshold. So that basically speaks to the financial prudence that we do take at the City of Ottawa. When you look at our global debt, I don't have that schedule in front of me, but you can get that up online. The bulk of our debt is funded through the federal gas tax debt and development charge debt. So see, that's debt that is funded by other sources, not the residential or commercial taxpayer. So we leverage those debt mechanisms as well to kind of help fund those projects that meet those criteria from a development charge perspective, those projects that meet the criteria for the federal gas tax. So the city receives around $55 to $60 million in federal gas tax and another 50 or so from provincial gas tax. So we leverage that stream of revenue for other debt-related services, so that doesn't pass the burden on to the residents of Stittsville, or I was going to say Stittsville, but the residents of Ottawa ultimately.
Yeah. Okay. I hope that answers your question, Mark. Thanks, Cyril. Another question from Mark. What is the expected tax revenue from the vacant unit tax, and what is it costing to administer the program? Do you have those handy, Cyril?
Yeah, may not be exact, but definitely within the ballpark. So basically in the 2023 draft budget, I think the total revenue that we have there for collection is 6.6 million. Once we take out our cost administrator program, which is roughly around 1.2 million, I believe, when you look at the overall city services to support that program, there's a net of $4.4 million that we will be contributing to the housing affordability plan. So one of the benefits of this VUT program is the contribution, not only in terms of trying to get more housing stock online for rentals, but also the funding that we will get from this program, which again will be a net of 4.4 million in 2023, contributing to the affordable housing plan for the city.
Okay, great example of where when we collect taxes for a certain program, we're restricted in where those can go. So those go specific towards affordable housing initiatives. A question from Mark. Are we using the city reserves for things other than capital? Maybe if I could broaden that, Cyril, can you just briefly explain what city reserves are and how they're used, and any other rules around how they can be used, I guess?
Yeah, so the city has a number of, we must have close to 15 to 20 different reserves. Every reserve is accompanied by a bylaw, which lays out the restrictions, what that reserve can be used for. As an example, the citywide capital reserve, that's our main reserve that we would use to fund roads resurfacing, sidewalk repair, building repairs, etc. So that capital reserve is exclusively for capital. So we don't take money from there to fund operating. When you look at the rate program, we have a water reserve, we have a wastewater reserve, and then we have a storm reserve. So we actually have a reserve for or per each of the three different rate programs. That reserve is what we call a combined reserve. So that reserve funds the operating and capital requirements of drinking water. So the drinking water, all the revenue that we collect from your water uses, so your drinking water, water in your lawns, etc., that money goes into that water reserve, and that water reserve then funds the operating and capital. When you look at some of the other nuances like the tax stabilization reserve, that's basically the one operating reserve that we use to fund potential deficits in a given year or any unforeseen event that we don't have in our base budget. So, and then of course, there's other restricted reserves such as the building code reserves. They're really restricted just to specific building code usages. There's other reserves in terms of the parking reserve. That parking reserve is strictly isolated to parking functions in the City of Ottawa. et cetera, et cetera. So basically every reserve is accompanied with an applicable bylaw, which really limits the usage in terms of the true course or sources of the funding for the reserve.
Yeah, it came up at our Transit Commission meeting that I was chairing the other day. We had an 8.5-hour meeting on transit, and about half of that was the budget. And one of my colleagues had a motion to make fares free for kids up to 12 years old. I think they're only free now for kids up to 7 or 8. But we needed to find $90,000 somewhere in the budget to make this happen. And someone suggested the tax stabilization reserve. You spoke about that earlier. That's one of the sources for snow clearing if we go over budget. And your colleague Isabel from the finance department was very quick to correct us on that, said, no, you didn't, that tax stabilization reserve was not collected for transit. You cannot access it for a transit operational thing. So there's a lot of governance and accounting around these reserves, and their use is very much restricted and controlled so that it's used for what it was saved for in the first place. Yeah. There's a couple more questions about firefighters. I can answer this one. This is there a plan to put full-time firefighters in Stittsville this year? What is the additional cost? By how much does this improve response times? So there are full-time firefighters in Stittsville. We have full-time firefighters, we have volunteer firefighters. I never think volunteer is quite the right name because they are paid very well, and they are also fully trained as firefighters. But at Station 81 and at Station 43, 81 is the one on Stittsville, Maine, 43 is the one at Iber. There's a combination of firefighters. And so now in terms of what does this look like in the future, this is another thing that I expect we'll see in the next year or two at our Emergency and Protective Services Committee. These things are constantly under review. There are standards and response times that need to be met. I last met with the police chief last year, and encouraging to hear that all of the legislated response times are being met. So we're really well covered in Stittsville, but what they're doing is they're looking into the next 10, 15, 20 years and making sure that we have a long-term plan that the community's covered. I know in Canada North, there's some money for the construction of a new fire station in Canada North, because there's some growth to that part of the neighborhood. So there's always new resources being added for Ottawa Fire in the West End, but specifically looking at full-time firefighters, volunteer, hybrid stations, and so on. That will be coming in a report this year as well. And Dean had a follow-up. I read one of Dean's questions first about that discrepancy between the taxation difference between parts of Stittsville. So just in case I wasn't clear, Dean has asked me to clarify. Half of Stittsville pays more for fire protection than the other half. All of Stittsville will have the same 4 fire apparatus attend to their home or building should there be reports of smoke showing. So I think that's correct, that all of Stittsville has the same requirements for response time and so on, and equipment response, but some people in Stittsville pay less than others do on their fire because of the historical distinction between the urban and rural areas. There will be a report coming to committee and council within the next year. So that'll be a topic we'll be following closely here in Stittsville.
Councillor, maybe we'll take that as a takeaway, just so
Sure.
I can get my team to work with the fire team as well to see what timing is, just so we kind of bring back a better response through yourself, through the resident, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, there's a question from Ade. I'm sorry, Ade. I'm not sure how to pronounce your name, but it says he sent me a request this morning about asking staff to respond to Regulation 399, jurisdiction of council to negotiate the police board budget once every 3 years. So I did see that email. I haven't had a chance to confer with staff, but I will be following up with the clerk's office to better understand what that regulation is and what ability council has to negotiate the police board budget. So once I have some more information from our city clerk's office, I'll be happy to answer that. Lots of questions. This is great. Peter has a question. Maybe it's not a question. Peter, I'm not sure what this is about. You sent a question to the mayor, not a budget question. You're not getting things paid attention to. If you ever don't have a question answered to your satisfaction, you can always talk to me as a counselor, and there's also some other venues if you don't think you're being responded to properly or promptly. So please let me know about that for sure. From Eric, how far along in terms of design or consultation does a project like Shea Woods Park or general improvements need to be before being earmarked in the budget? Just wondering if these items are earmarked because they are design complete. I would say it depends. In the case of Shea Woods, the city council approved purchase and acquisition of the land last year. And so the next step after that would be to get the funding to do the landscaping, the fencing around it essentially, and some work to make sure the pathways are resilient, because if there's a lot of people walking with their dogs, it's a lot of wear and tear on the pathways. One other step in the process that needs to be done this year is a consultation with the public. So we're going to be going to the public and looking for your feedback. There'll probably be a draft plan about, you know, what type of fencing is used and signage, a draft plan of the pathways. The plan is to take the existing pathways, but identify the major ones and make sure that they are properly maintained going forward, touching as little of the forest as possible, like as hands-off as possible. And so watch for that probably late spring this year. And we have the money in order to do that design and that consultation, so, and eventually the construction as well. So that's what that's there for. That probably be similar with most of the larger park projects. I mentioned one at Forest Creek where they're going to be redoing the pathways that are in just awful, horrible shape. They did all of the design work on that last year, but we have the budget this year in order to move forward and do it. So it really depends on the project. But in general, I think the timing of the funding that you see is very well aligned to, you know, within a year or two of when these projects would actually be built and so on. Cyril, anything you would add to that?
No, I mean, the only other thing, I mean, in terms of the process, right? So our infrastructure team and even our transportation team that looks at a lot of the growth projects, there's a really, you know, it is relatively robust process that they go through in terms of looking at all the capital programs citywide. So I'll speak to it as a resident of Stittsville. I may think that, you know, street ABC is in really poor condition, but there could be a street in Canada as an example that's even worse condition. So they kind of go to that priority stage setting where in terms of, you know, they don't look at it ward by ward, they look at it globally across the city and try and make sure that depending on the state of the asset and the condition, that the priority really starts to line up with that state as opposed to sprinkling, you know, funding around, if you will, to the different areas.
Yeah, okay. Hey, Peter had a couple of vacant unit tax questions. I can answer one. Maybe you know the other, Cyril. One is basically, could we not just look at water bills? And if a home or a unit is not using water, wouldn't that clue us in as to whether it's vacant? So this came up when we were looking at implementing this new vacant unit tax. We can't for privacy reasons. Same thing with hydro. We can't use hydro to determine whether or not a unit's vacant or not. There's privacy restrictions on that. So something we looked into, we just aren't allowed to do that. It may or may not be easier, but in any case, privacy rules prevent it. And then the other question Peter had on the VUT is how much did the mailers, all of the letters and written information cost for the city? Do you happen to know offhand, Cyril, or is that something we can follow up on later?
We can follow up on that later. I mean, I wouldn't have that level of detail broken down. What I could say, you know, I'll speak, you know, it does seem frustrating at times when you receive a letter in November, you filled out your application in early January when the portal opened, and all of a sudden you get another letter. Basically, through all the review and study that we did across, you know, various municipalities across Canada and globally, where the VUT was a mechanism that was brought in place, this was basically the best results process that we could implement. And really what we want to do is we wanted to make sure we communicated, I'll call it communication overload. The more communication we got out to inform the residents of the timing and the process, the better. And in some cases, yes, some residents would have already completed their declaration and a second one would have been sent out. Again, because of the timing, we didn't really have enough time to kind of see what the first cycle would bring, and then wait and then mail it out. So we made the decision to kind of have a little bit of a communication blitz, but we will be reporting back throughout this term of council in terms of the results of this program. What I could say, as of mid last week, I think we're roughly around 80% of the properties in the city of Ottawa were declared. So basically, we have approximately 330,000 homes that we're targeting, and at mid last week, we were about 80%. So that's an extremely successful indicator so far. Most of the other municipalities and jurisdictions, nationally and globally, they haven't seen that uptake. So that's kind of kudos to the residents of Ottawa in terms of getting their declarations in.
Yeah, well, thanks to everyone who's taken the time to make that declaration. The deadline is March 13th, is it?
Yes, I believe so. Yeah, I think so.
So about a month left to do that. And you said earlier it was the expected revenue in the first year was 6.3 that will go towards affordable housing, 6.3 million?
6.6 million total.
Okay.
Once we remove the cost of the program, there's a net of 4.4 million flagged to go to affordable housing.
Yeah. Okay. Helen has kindly corrected me. I said station 43 on IBER. It's actually station 46. So thank you, Helen, for that fact checking. I see a couple questions from Mark about waste management and recycling. Because it's not specific to the budget, I'm going to just ask if you want to send me an email with that. It's glen.gower@ottawa.ca. There is quite a bit of work happening over the next little bit around updating our waste management practices in the city of Ottawa. So be happy to share some of that information with you. A question about climate, Cyril. What is putting a climate lens on the budget? What does that mean exactly, and how have we done that in this year's budget?
So that's a good question, and one of the perks I'm happy about this budget. So basically, what we have in this budget is, there's a funding source of $5 million per year for this term of council dedicated exclusively net incremental to climate change. The other thing that we've done this year is in the past 9 months, we've been working extremely close with our climate change team, and we've applied a climate change lens to our budget. So if you were to reference any of the 2023 draft capital projects or capital details in the various committee in the overall budget book, you will see there's a couple categories there in terms of climate resiliency and climate adaptation. And really, we're trying to make climate change a part of every day of the operations of the city. So basically, we're looking at all capital programs and defining, okay, does this capital program reduce GHG emissions? So some of the easy ones would be, obviously, as we move towards electrifying our bus fleet, that's a 100% direct contribution to reducing GHG gas emissions. Other areas could be as simple as in terms of our watershed and our water flooding mapping. So that's kind of investments towards adaptation. So really, this was basically step one. It's not one of those commitments where we done this, now we move on. We're committed to continue to work with the climate change team and grow that climate change lens to our budget, so we truly understand, how much of that big $4.5 billion is truly contributing to, whether it's direct contribution to GHG reductions, or is it a minor contribution to adaptation, but really moving the pendulum forward in terms of how we do our budget. I am not personally aware of any other municipality in the province or Canada that does this level of detail. So again, I think it's a step in the right direction. It's not the final step. It's not a huge step, but it definitely is a step in the right direction towards working towards that climate change.
Okay. And you mentioned the electric bus initiative. Thanks to some funding from the federal government, that's going to be close to a $1 billion investment over the next 4 years to convert 350 buses from diesel, replacing diesel buses with electric buses. We've talked a bit about 2.5% tax increase. Do you have the rough numbers? A suburban home, what an average home would see, like actual dollars?
The problem with all these numbers is all these numbers up in my head. I can visually see it, but I don't have that document in front of me. What I will say, Councillor, it is in the transmittal report, which again is online. We have a nice table there that kind of highlights the impact. And as soon as I hang up on this call, that number is going to come to me, but I don't have it readily available. I'm at my home office, so usually in my office, I would have all that stuff readily available.
Well, I may have it in my notes because I know I wrote it down. It was February 1st when we had our big budget meeting at council. Did I write it down that day?
I do have it.
We can look it up for anyone.
So the total change. So basically, on an average assessed house at $415,000, the incremental change from 2022 is a $104 change.
Okay.
The total assessed value, basically your taxation would be around $4,200 from a year perspective. And again, that's $100 more than 2022. So that's roughly what it would represent on your assessed value of $415,000.
All right, thank you. Off the top of your head, impressive, sir. There's we're basically at time, and I want to thank residents for all your questions. There's one other thing we didn't talk about, and I want to mention it so people know. One of the things that we're being asked to approve is a proposal for a process called the Service Efficiency and Competitiveness Framework and Methodology. And basically this is stemming from a promise from Mayor Sutcliffe in his election campaign to really do people call it a line-by-line budget review, but basically it's looking at every program and services and looking for ways to make more effective use of the budgets that we have and serve the public better. So if you're interested on that information's on the budget website as well. And there's a whole document outlining how that process would work. And the idea is by 2024, we should have several of those programs reviewed and maybe see some changes in the 2024 budget that we'll be starting to deliberate this fall as a council. As Cyril said, right now we are going through committee by committee and doing a discussion and debate and hearing from public delegations on each budget. We did our transit budget last week. I'm really happy with how that ended up. We have a $27.5 million increase to operations, which is about a 5% increase to transit. That'll allow OC Transpo to hire 360 new operators. And there's a lot of issues right now with late buses, and a lot of the budget is focused on addressing those issues and increasing reliability. I've got Planning and Housing Committee this week. I'm sure affordable housing investments will be pretty important on that agenda. There's the Environment and Climate Change Committee next week. So lots of big discussions about budget culminating with March 1st, and always appreciate people's questions and comments. We're going to do another councillor chat, just a general in-person councillor chat in March. So watch for details on that soon. And to wrap it up, I want to say a big thanks to Cyril. Here's a comment from one of our residents. You know your stuff, very well prepared, tax dollars well spent. So thank you, Cyril. And I'm glad to say you're a Stittsville resident. That's great.
And I don't know who that's from, but I don't think it's my wife upstairs adding to your chat.
And thank you to Lisa and Kara, who are here with me at the office, helping behind the scenes as well. And again, thanks to residents for tuning in and all the excellent questions. If there's anything else you think of or anything we weren't able to cover, please email me and we'd be happy to track down some answers for you. So have a great night. Take care.
Thank you.